The Duke of Burgundy, bold and resolute as ever, found himself overwhelmed beneath the fierce valor of the Helvetian forces. That night, Bonaparte rested at Morden, a place where, as with every town he passed, the highest honors awaited him, honors not just of ceremony, but of whispered awe and admiration. Yet, come morning, fate intervened in the form of a broken carriage, compelling him and those who accompanied him, only a few officers and a modest escort of local dragoons, to continue their journey on foot. The air was still crisp, the earth beneath their feet soft and uneven, as they moved steadily forward, the quiet crunch of boots mingling with distant birdsong. At a certain point, Bonaparte paused near the ossuary, a solemn place steeped in memory. He wished to see the very ground where the Battle of Morat had been fought, a plain laid out before the chapel, marked by the shadows of the past. An officer, once a soldier in the French ranks, stood nearby and recounted how the Swiss, descending from the surrounding mountains, had used the cover of a dense wood to outflank the Burgundian army, turning their strength into chaos, driving them into a rout. What strength did that Burgundian army muster? Bonaparte inquired, his voice steady yet curious. 60,000 men, came the reply. 60,000 men, he exclaimed, a flicker of disbelief crossing his features. They ought to have completely covered those mountains. Lannes, one of his officers, interjected softly, "The French fight better now." But Bonaparte, shaking his head, interrupted gently, "At that time, the Burgundians were not Frenchmen." His journey through Switzerland was more than mere passage. It was a balm to restless spirits, a soothing presence that quelled many anxieties. From Meudon, he pressed onward to Rastatt, passing through Aix in Savoy, Bern, and Basel. Night enfolded them as they arrived in Bern, and the streets were alive with light. Rows of carriages, their lanterns glowing warmly, filled with elegant women whose eyes shone with admiration. Their voices rose in unison, a chorus of "Long live Bonaparte, long live the pacificator," an enthusiasm so genuine that it could only be truly felt by those who had witnessed it firsthand. But with this new stature came a certain distance. The familiar, easy camaraderie of his school days at Brienne was no longer fitting. The old friends who once spoke to him simply now found themselves constrained by the weight of his achievements and the society he had entered. One such figure was Monsieur de Comminges, a schoolmate who had emigrated, and now, upon hearing of Bonaparte's arrival in Basel, appeared without ceremony, disregarding the respect due to a man who had become so illustrious. Bonaparte, stung by this breach of decorum, refused to receive him again, his displeasure clear and unyielding. No persuasion could soften his resolve, and the bonds of boyhood, once so strong, were left to wither in silence. When they reached Rastatt, the air was thick with the anticipation of formal peace talks with the German Empire. The Peace of Leoben had been struck only with Austria, but the full settlement lay ahead. Here, Bonaparte found a letter from the Directory summoning him back to Paris. He welcomed this call eagerly, ready to leave a place where his role was but minor, determined never to return. Soon after arriving in Paris, he sought permission to recall part of his household left behind at Rastatt, a clear indication that his presence there was meant to be brief. The Directory, contrary to some beliefs, did not wish to keep him away from the critical affairs at Rastatt. Indeed, they would have gladly seen him return there and be absent from Paris. but the endless, tedious negotiations wore heavily on Bonaparte's spirit. The slow grind of diplomacy, with its delays and compromises, was a chain he was eager to break. He had tasted this bitterness before at Campo Formio, and had no desire to repeat it. Upon arrival at Rastatt, it became clear that Bonaparte's stay would be fleeting. I expressed my own wish to remain in Germany, unaware then that my name had been removed from the emigrant list, a bureaucratic act that arrived too late for me to know before our departure from Milan. The excuse for the delay in this erasure, despite Bonaparte's repeated requests, was flimsy and frustrating, a symptom of the petty jealousies and weaknesses that plagued the Directory. Bonaparte, in a tone edged with indignation, urged me, "Come, cross the Rhine. They will not dare seize you while you are near me. I answer for your safety." When I reached Paris, I found that the erasure had finally taken place, though the official reasons given varied strangely between documents. One letter from the Minister of General Police claimed that the government wished not to leave the name of a devoted citizen among traitors, while the decree itself stated simply that I had never emigrated. In the quiet moments of reflection, I recall the stories whispered in exile. At St. Helena, it was said that Bonaparte returned from Italy with no more than 300,000 francs, but I know this to be false. He carried with him more than 3 million. How else could he have afforded the extensive repairs, the embellishments, and the furnishing of his house in the Rue Chantereine? How could he have maintained the household he did on a mere 15,000 francs of income and the allowances of his rank? Even the coastal excursion I will speak of later cost nearly 12,000 francs in gold, a sum he entrusted to me to cover the journey's expenses, and I doubt he was ever repaid. Whether 300,000 or 3 million, it mattered little for any purpose of disguise, for no one could accuse him of peculation. He was a strict and unyielding administrator, quick to anger at fraud, and relentless in pursuit of those guilty. He wished to stand independent, knowing well that independence required fortune. "I am no Capuchin," he would often say, "not I." Yet, while he was allowed only 300,000 francs upon arrival from the wealthy lands of Italy, some printed claims spoke of 20 million, or even double that, upon his return from Egypt, a land poor in gold, where victory was shadowed by misfortune. These tales were false. The truth of what he brought from Italy stands firm, and the treasure he carried from Egypt will be revealed in time. Within his family, his brothers sought to dominate his mind, striving to diminish the influence Josephine held over him through love and devotion. They stirred jealousy and seized upon her stay in Milan after our departure, a stay sanctioned by Bonaparte himself, to sow discord. Yet my closeness to both husband and wife allowed me to shield them from much harm. If Josephine still lived, she would acknowledge this quiet service. I was never, save once and reluctantly, an adversary to her. That one occasion concerned the marriage of her daughter Hortense. Bonaparte wished to unite Hortense with Duroc, and his brothers supported this plan, eager to separate Josephine from the child to whom Bonaparte felt the deepest affection. Josephine, however, preferred Hortense to marry Louis Bonaparte, seeking alliance in a family where she found little kindness. She prevailed. Before her marriage to Louis, Hortense had cared for Duroc, a handsome man in his 30s and a favorite of Bonaparte. Yet Duroc's indifference to Louis Bonaparte's marriage plans revealed that his feelings were not returned with passion. He might have taken Hortense's hand had he accepted the terms Bonaparte offered, but he sought something greater, and prudence failed him at a moment when ambition could have been gratified. He declined, and thus the union of Hortense and Louis, which Madame Bonaparte pursued to win favor with her brothers-in-law, was set in motion. Despite whispers of hostility from Bonaparte's brothers toward Josephine, Joseph Bonaparte later assured that none but Louis had remained close to Napoleon since his Italian campaign, and Louis could not be suspected of intrigue against Josephine, whose daughter he married. Such calumnies were unfounded. Upon his return from Rastatt, the Luxembourg Palace was transformed into a scene of grandeur for Bonaparte's reception. The great courtyard was adorned with elegant decorations, and near the palace stood an amphitheatre built for officials and dignitaries. Curiosity drew crowds, filling the space, while the altar of the country, flanked by statues of liberty, equality, and peace, stood solemnly opposite the main entrance. As Bonaparte entered, heads were uncovered in respect, windows bright with the faces of young and beautiful women. Yet beneath this grand display lay a chill, a quiet reserve rather than warmth, a crowd gathered more for spectacle than genuine joy or gratitude. A sudden accident cast a shadow over the ceremony. The right wing of the palace remained unoccupied, though preparations had been made there. An officer was tasked with preventing access, but a clerk of the Directory managed to climb the scaffolding. No sooner had he placed a foot on the first plank than it shifted, and he fell the entire height into the courtyard below. The shock was palpable. Stunned gasps, fainting ladies, and windows quickly emptied of their occupants. Nevertheless, the Directory maintained their republican pomp with speeches aplenty. Talleyrand, then Minister for Foreign Affairs, introduced Bonaparte to the Directory with a lengthy oration, hinting that the general's personal greatness need not inspire fear even in a rising republic. Far from fearing his ambition, he said, we may one day have to beg him to tear himself away from the pleasures of studious retirement. All France shall be free, but perhaps he never will. Such is his destiny. His words were met with impatience, for all awaited Bonaparte's own voice. When the conqueror of Italy stood to speak, his manner was modest, yet firm. His address was brief, a congratulation on the nation's improved state. Barras, president of the Directory, replied with such prolixity that weariness spread among listeners. Upon finishing, he threw himself into Bonaparte's arms, an embrace called fraternal, though the general was less pleased by such theatrical displays. The other Directory members followed suit, each performing their part in the sentimental pageantry as best they could. For the occasion, Chenier composed a hymn, set to music by Méhul, while soon after, an opera titled The Fall of Carthage premiered, a veiled nod to the anticipated exploits of the newly appointed commander of the Army of England. Poets busied themselves with praise, and Lebrun penned a couplet, though lacking the fiery spirit of Pindar, that read, Eros, cher à la paix, aux arts, à la victoire, il conquit en 2 ans 1000 siècles de gloire, translated to, Hero, dear to peace, to the arts, to victory. He conquered in 2 years 1,000 centuries of glory. The 2 legislative councils were not to be outdone by the Directory's display. Days later, they hosted a banquet in Bonaparte's honor within the Louvre's gallery, recently enriched by masterpieces seized in Italy. In Paris, Bonaparte bore himself with notable modesty. When the administrators of the Seine sent a deputation to inquire when they might visit him, he personally delivered his reply, accompanied by General Berthier. On the evening of his arrival, the judge of the peace called upon him, and Bonaparte returned the visit the following morning. Such small courtesies, seemingly trivial, worked subtly on the minds of Parisians, softening the edges of his growing fame. The triumphs of Bonaparte, the peace he had wrought, and the splendor of his reception cast the memory of Vendémiaire into the shadows. Everyone yearned for a glimpse of the young hero, whose meteoric rise had begun with such brilliance. Though he lived quietly, he frequented the theatre, drawn to its dramas and refinements. One day, he asked me to arrange the performance of 2 of the finest plays of the time, featuring celebrated actors like Elevieux and Mesdames Saint-Aubin and Phyllis. His wish was that both pieces be staged on the same night, if possible. The manager assured me that nothing the conqueror of Italy desired was impossible, for the word impossible had long since vanished from his dictionary. Bonaparte laughed heartily at this reply, his spirit light amidst the weight of his responsibilities. When we arrived at the theatre that evening, he took his place as always in the back of the box, seated behind Madame Bonaparte, with me beside her. Yet it was not long before the audience realized he was among them. The pit and boxes erupted in cries, calling for him again and again. The air was thick with anticipation, the murmur of voices rising and falling like waves, and once more the drums rolled across the valley of his destiny. And so, as night fell, the march continued. The theatre was alive with delicate strains, the air filled with the soft echoes of accomplished performers. Napoleon, ever the master of circumstance, expressed a wish, simple yet profound, that these 2 pieces might be played on the very same night, if it could be arranged. The manager, with a respectful smile, assured him that nothing the conqueror of Italy desired was impossible. Indeed, the word impossible had long vanished from Napoleon's world. His hearty laughter at this answer was a quiet testament to his confidence, a light moment amidst the weight of his ambitions. When we later attended the theatre together, he settled himself in his usual seat at the back of the box, behind Madame Bonaparte, seating me beside her. Yet the whispers and murmurs soon told the story. The audience knew he was among them. Calls for him rose from the pit and boxes, earnest and insistent, but he remained hidden, a shadow behind the curtains, refusing to show himself, despite their longing. Not long after, at the Théâtre des Arts, during the second showing of Horatius Cocles, though he sat discreetly in the second tier, the crowd once again discovered his presence. Cheers and acclamations burst forth from all corners, a tide of voices swelling and rolling like waves. Yet, true to his cautious nature, he kept himself as concealed as possible, murmuring to a companion in the next box, "Had I known the boxes were so exposed, I should not have come." That was the paradox of his presence, a man who commanded attention, but shied from the glare of it. Amidst these public moments, shadows lurked closer. A woman, moved by some dreadful knowledge, sent a messenger to warn Napoleon that his life was threatened, that poison had been plotted against him. The bearer of this warning was arrested, and accompanied by the judge of the peace, they went to the woman's house. There, they found her stretched upon the floor, drenched in her own blood. The conspirators, enraged that she had revealed their secret, had butchered her with savage cruelty. Her throat was cruelly cut, and not content with this, her body bore the marks of sharp instruments, wounds cruel and merciless. Such was the grim cost of the peril that shadowed Napoleon, a cost paid in blood and silence. On the night of the 10th of Nivose, the small street where Napoleon had a modest house, Rue Chantereine, was renamed Rue de la Victoire by decree, a name heavy with promise and triumph. The cries of Vive Bonaparte echoed through the air, incense offered lavishly in his honor. Yet these tributes did little to draw him from his quiet habits. Once the mighty conqueror and ruler of Italy, now dwelling under the watchful eyes of men he neither respected nor trusted, he confided to me, "The people of Paris do not remember anything. Were I to remain here long, doing nothing, I should be lost. In this great Babylon, one reputation displaces another. Let me be seen but 3 times at the theatre, and I shall no longer excite attention, so I shall go there but seldom." When he did attend, he chose a box shrouded in curtains, a retreat within the spectacle. The opera's manager wished to stage a special performance in his honor, but Napoleon declined. When I remarked that it must please him to see his fellow citizens so eager to follow him, he replied with a shrug, "Bah! The people would crowd just as fast to see me if I were going to the scaffold." This remark, bitter and true, echoed the age-old truth of fame's fickle nature. The cheers of today, the jeers of tomorrow, all part of the same restless tide. On the 28th of December, Napoleon was named a member of the Institute, in the class of Sciences and Arts, a distinction he took with deep pride. He cherished this honor, and often used the title in his proclamations, the allowance attached to the appointment remaining in the imperial accounts to the end. He replaced Carnot, the exiled director, stepping into a role that symbolized recognition, not just of his military prowess, but of his intellect and ambition. He expressed his gratitude in a letter to Camus, the president of the class, writing with a humility that contrasted with his grand designs. "Citizen President, the suffrage of the distinguished men who compose the Institute confers a high honor on me. I feel well assured that, before I can be their equal, I must long be their scholar. If there were any way more expressive than another of making known my esteem for you, I should be glad to employ it. True conquests, the only ones which leave no regret behind them, are those which are made over ignorance. The most honorable, as well as the most useful occupation for nations, is the contributing to the extension of human knowledge. The true power of the French Republic should henceforth be made to consist in not allowing a single new idea to exist without making it part of its property. Bonaparte." Yet beneath these scholarly words lay a restless spirit, eager for more than titles or honors. He renewed his attempts to obtain a dispensation of the age necessary to become a director, though these efforts were unsuccessful. On the 29th of January 1798, he confided to me, "Bourrienne, I do not wish to remain here. There is nothing to do. They are unwilling to listen to anything. I see that if I linger here, I shall soon lose myself. Everything wears out here. My glory has already disappeared. This little Europe does not supply enough of it for me. I must seek it in the East, the fountain of glory. However, I wish first to make a tour along the coast, to ascertain by my own observation what may be attempted. I will take you, Lannes, and Sulkowski with me. If the success of a descent on England appears doubtful, as I suspect it will, the army of England shall become the army of the East, and I will go to Egypt. These words reveal the core of his being. War and conquest, the forging of glory, were the lifeblood that coursed through him. The thought of languishing in Paris, idle while fresh laurels awaited elsewhere, was unbearable. His imagination raced beyond the present, inscribing his name upon the vast monuments of history, those eternal testaments to human endeavor. If Caesar fought 50 battles, he longed to fight 100. If Alexander journeyed to the temple of Ammon, he wished to travel to the cataracts of the Nile. His was a race with fame itself, each step driven by the certainty that his return to France would be both necessary and triumphant, that he would claim his place, not as a forgotten man, but as a hero whose glory had only grown. And so, in the early days of February 1798, he left Paris, not on orders as many believed, but by his own will, to journey northward. The purpose was not the preparation for an invasion of England, as newspapers hastily claimed, but a swift reconnaissance along the coast. With Lannes, Sulkowski, and myself, and our courier Moustache, we travelled rapidly through towns and ports, Etaples, Ambleteuse, Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk, Furnes, Newport, Ostend, and the Isle of Walcheren. Napoleon's keen mind absorbed every detail, questioning sailors, smugglers, and fishermen with a tact and intelligence that marked him apart. The journey was brief, a week's passage that ended with our return through Antwerp, Brussels, Lille, and Saint-Quentin. When I asked him, "Well, General, what think you of our journey? Are you satisfied?" he answered with certainty, "It is too great a chance. I will not hazard it. I would not thus sport with the fate of my beloved France." In that moment, I could already see him in Cairo, his mind stretching far beyond the coasts we had visited. Back in Paris, Napoleon wasted no time in setting the wheels in motion for the grand expedition to the banks of the Nile, a project that had long occupied his thoughts. As early as August 1797, he had written of the necessity to attack Egypt to destroy England's power effectively. To Talleyrand, newly Minister of Foreign Affairs, he expressed that Egypt should be taken, for it did not truly belong to the Grand Signior. Talleyrand, ever the diplomat, acknowledged the grandeur of these ideas and promised to write at length on the subject. History would judge Talleyrand with a complexity that mirrored his own careful steps through the corridors of power. Yet those who knew him well recognized a man of honor and profound talent, a political mind both wise and moderate. I, too, admired him for this. In November, under the guise of inspecting the Levantine ports, Napoleon sent Poussielgue to finalize plans for the expedition against Malta. General Desai, a trusted confidant, wrote from Germany expressing keen interest in the fleet at Corfu and beseeching Napoleon not to forget him should grand enterprises unfold. Napoleon did not forget, yet the Directory, cautious and wary, initially disapproved of the plan to seize Malta. The island had maintained neutrality and even aided French ships. There was no clear pretext for war. The legislative body, it was said, would not look kindly on such a venture. This opposition vexed Napoleon deeply, a disappointment that shadowed his welcome to Botot, Barras's agent, in October 1797. In a moment of frustration, he shrugged and said, "Mon Dieu, Malta is for sale." But soon, the tides turned. By late September, Talleyrand informed him that the Directory authorized the seizure of Malta, and Napoleon was entrusted with letters to prepare the public mind for this event. Napoleon threw himself into his work with a fervor I had never before witnessed. He studied the generals, assessed the strengths of the army corps, and issued orders with remarkable speed. To secure the necessary approvals, he would rush to the Luxembourg to obtain signatures, often from Merlin de Douai, the most reliable director. He kept the Secretary-General Lagarde in the dark, not wishing him to know the details. The funds for the expedition, over 3 million francs, were transferred to Toulon from money seized at Berne, a fortune in those chaotic times when finances were poorly managed and revenues squandered before arrival. The expedition to the east was to be unlike any other. Amidst the turmoil, two things gave me comfort: my friendship with the conqueror of Italy, and the promise of journeying through those ancient lands steeped in history and legend that had long fascinated me. It was at Passeriano, in the twilight of his European labors, that Napoleon's thoughts first turned seriously to the east. In the magnificent park, during long evening strolls, he would speak of the great events and empires that once flourished there. "Europe is a molehill," he would say. "There have never been great empires and revolutions except in the East, where there are 600 million men." To him, the East was the cradle of religious and metaphysical marvels, a subject as inexhaustible as it was captivating. He shared these reflections freely with his close generals, with Monge, and with me. Monge, too, shared his enthusiasm, his scientific spirit ignited by Napoleon's passion. All of us saw the expedition as a grand venture, yet the Directory played no active role in renewing this project. It was not their plan, but Napoleon's own design. The Directory was but a passive instrument, transforming his wishes into official decrees. He was neither ordered to conquer Egypt nor instructed in its execution. Napoleon alone organized the army of the East, raised funds, and gathered ships. His was the vision and the will that propelled the enterprise forward. And so, as night fell, the march continued. The grand design of the expedition to Egypt was renewed with a fervor that seemed to outpace the steady hand of the Directory, which found itself little more than a passive instrument, enacting decrees born entirely from the restless will of General Bonaparte. It was not the Directory that commanded the conquest, nor did it dictate how it was to unfold. Rather, Napoleon himself gathered the forces, raised the funds, and assembled ships, weaving together a plan as bold as it was uncertain. He conceived a remarkable idea: to accompany the army with men of science and art, whose work would reveal the mysteries of a land whose very name stirred echoes of ancient grandeur and timeless wonder. Orders flashed like lightning from Toulon to Civitavecchia, precise and swift, as Bonaparte orchestrated the movements of his forces, some to assemble before Malta, others before Alexandria, dictating every detail in the quiet of his cabinet. France, fresh from the Treaty of Campo Formio, might have found greater advantage in pressing its victories closer to home, for a triumph on the Adige could have been far more beneficial than distant conquests on the Nile. Yet the Directory, perhaps weary or wary of the rising star that threatened to outshine them, seemed to let jealousy and envy temper their judgment. They allowed Bonaparte to pursue his hazardous dream, perhaps hoping to rid themselves of a man whose popularity flamed too brightly, even if it meant risking the loss of a fine army and the fleet that carried it. For Bonaparte, the choice was stark: the perilous venture to Egypt or certain obscurity. He saw in Egypt not only a battlefield, but a stage upon which to uphold his reputation and carve fresh glory. On the 12th of April, 1798, the mantle of General-in-Chief of the Army of the East was placed upon his shoulders, a signal that the wheels of destiny were turning inexorably. Amid these sweeping tides of history, life's quieter moments flickered. Marmont found love in marriage to Mademoiselle Perregaux, and La Valetta, Bonaparte's aide-de-camp, to Mademoiselle Beauharnais. Though some tales would later twist these unions into fanciful stories, the truth was far simpler, yet no less binding. Threads of loyalty and companionship woven into the fabric of the campaign. In a rare moment of candor, shortly before departure, I asked Napoleon how long he intended to remain in Egypt. His reply was measured yet daring. A few months, or 6 years, all depends on circumstances. I will colonize the country. I will bring them artists and artisans of every description, women, actors, and more. We are but 29 now, and shall then be 35. That is not old age. Those 6 years will enable me, if all goes well, to get to India. He urged me to claim I was bound for Brest, even to my own family, a testament to the secrecy and caution cloaking the expedition. Bonaparte's mind was always restless, even in the minutiae. He wished to form a camp library, a collection of cabinet editions to accompany the soldiers and officers, volumes spanning arts and science, geography and travels, history, poetry, romance, politics, and morals. The list, penned in his own hand with its charming orthographic slips, Duchecling for Duguesclin, Ocean for Ossian, reflected the breadth of his interests and the rapid flow of his thoughts. Among these books were works from Plutarch to Homer, Montesquieu to the Koran, a testament to a mind hungry for knowledge, for understanding the world as well as commanding armies. Before setting sail, Bonaparte procured a considerable stock of Burgundy, supplied by a man named James from Dijon. This wine, carefully racked and sealed in casks, proved its worth by surviving the long sea voyage and the desert crossings without losing its rich character. It was a small comfort, perhaps, amidst the vast uncertainties ahead. The days before departure passed quietly in Paris, save for one conversation that revealed the steely resolve beneath Bonaparte's calm exterior. As we sought signatures for the expedition's papers in the Luxembourg, I asked if he still intended to leave France. His answer was stark. Yes, I have tried everything. They do not want me. I ought to overthrow them and make myself king, but it will not do yet. The nobles will never consent. The time is not yet come. I should be alone, but I will dazzle them again. The dream of power flickered in his eyes, but patience tempered it. Well, we will go to Egypt, I said, and the topic shifted. Though delays arose, notably a quarrel with Bernadotte in Vienna that postponed our departure by 2 weeks, Bonaparte's determination never wavered. Some would claim that these troubles tempted him to abandon the expedition, but letters from the time tell a different story. He remained resolute, commanding preparations to continue without falter. On the 3rd of May, 1798, we left Paris. Little did we know that just 10 days before, a prisoner named Sir Sidney Smith had escaped from the Temple, a small event that would ripple through time, altering the fate of the grandest schemes and daringest plans. This escape, trivial in itself, would later prove to be the shadow that unsettled the revolution of the East. We reached Toulon on the 8th, where Bonaparte, aware that the English fleet was on our trail, pressed for swift departure. Yet the winds held us for 10 long days, a torment of waiting, during which Napoleon's mind never ceased its ceaseless turning, attending to every detail of the fleet, every movement of men and ships. Before the soldiers, he made a stirring speech, words of courage and destiny that I set down as he spoke, which would later appear in the papers, echoing across the nation. The air rang with cries of "The Immortal Republic forever," and the singing of hymns that lifted spirits high above the gathering clouds of war. In these moments, the tender presence of Madame Bonaparte was a balm. Few women were more amiable, more captivating, and Napoleon's passion for her was profound. To savour her company a little longer, he brought her with us to Toulon. Their parting was a scene of deep emotion, a quiet farewell shadowed by the uncertainty of the path ahead. Later, during her stay at Plombières, she narrowly escaped a terrible accident when the balcony she sat upon gave way, plunging her and her attendants into the street below. Though injured, she survived without lasting harm, a fragile thread of fortune in the tapestry of fate. Amidst the preparations and farewells, news reached Bonaparte of grim acts carried out under the law against emigrants. An old man, aged and frail, shot alongside pregnant women and mothers with young children. Outraged by such cruelty, Napoleon's anger found voice in a letter I transcribed at his command, addressed to the military commissioners, beseeching mercy and humanity even in these harsh times. He reminded them that soldiers of liberty must not become executioners, that the law was meant to strike conspirators, not the vulnerable. His words bore the weight of authority and compassion. The officer who signs a sentence against a person incapable of bearing arms is a coward. This letter saved a man's life and revealed the measure of the power Napoleon already wielded, stepping beyond orders to temper justice with mercy. A servant named Simon, once an emigrant's follower and fearful of arrest, sought work with me. Bonaparte, moved by the man's plight, gave him his portfolio to carry, emblazoned with his name and rank. Whether it was this sign or their connection that shielded Simon, he passed unmolested and served faithfully, occasionally proving useful to Bonaparte himself. And so the days drew close to departure. The squadron stood ready to sail, the men poised between the known and the unknown, the promise of glory and the shadow of hardship stretching before them. The drums rolled once more across the harbour as the fleet prepared to leave, carrying with it the hopes and fears of a nation, the ambitions of a man, and the fragile lives of those who would follow him into the uncertain dawn. And so, as night fell, the march continued. The great fleet set sail on the 19th day of May, the heavy-laden Orient barely skimming the bottom of the sea before she was gently freed, a reminder of the precarious journey ahead. The voyage carried them swiftly toward Malta, where they arrived on the 10th of June, having lost 2 days waiting for convoys to join the fleet. The island, steeped in intrigue and suspicion, did not open its ports to them with the warmth or welcome that might have been hoped. Bonaparte's displeasure was palpable, directed sharply at the emissaries sent from Europe, whose schemes had fallen short. Among them was Monsieur Dolomieu, whose mission soured into regret, as the Sicilians treated him harshly amidst the tangled politics of the Mediterranean. Attempts at persuasion had been made by Monsieur Poussielgue, yet these efforts failed to fully sway the island's rulers. Tensions flared briefly, shots exchanged in a dance of hostility that was more ritual than real. Bonaparte, ever the keen observer and strategist, found satisfaction in the prudent and capable conduct of General Baraguer-Diliers, whose division had arrived from Genoa. This general was charged with landing and mounting an assault on the western part of Malta, a task he executed with skill and discretion, earning the admiration of the commander-in-chief. Yet all who were privy to the truth knew these maneuvers were but a guise, a formality to preserve the honor of the knights who held the island. For no one, having seen Malta's formidable and near impenetrable fortifications, could believe it might fall in mere days to a fleet shadowed by a relentless enemy. The island's defences were so complete, so resolutely unyielding, that General Caffarelli, after inspecting the bastions and ramparts, remarked to Bonaparte with a wry smile, "Upon my word, General, it is luck. There is someone inside the town to open the gates for us." This observation, tinged with irony, reflected the bitter truth behind the grand plans of conquest. Bonaparte himself, in later years, would claim the capture of Malta was the result not of secret dealings, but of his own strategic genius, asserting that he had seized the island long before, while still at Mantua. Yet the reality was more tangled, woven with clandestine instructions and private intrigues which he had dictated, threading through the complex tapestry of political maneuvering. Malta, with all its might and glory, lacked the moral strength to resist. The knights, though not dishonorable, were powerless against the tide that had been set in motion before the fleet even left Toulon. The general-in-chief turned his attention to the plight of the Turkish prisoners held by the knights, confined within the grim galleys that lined the harbour. These vessels, foul and oppressive, were emptied, their captives freed by the same principles of reason and humanity that would soon underpin Bonaparte's proclamations to the Egyptians. Amidst the grandeur of the Grand Master's gardens, where orange trees bore their luscious fruit beneath the scorching sun, Bonaparte walked thoughtfully, tasting the sweetness that the heat intensified, a brief respite before the storms of war to come. By the 19th of June, having established governance and defence over the island, Bonaparte departed Malta, unaware that he had, in effect, handed it over to the English, whose gratitude was scant and fleeting. Many knights chose to follow him, accepting posts both civil and military, weaving their fates into the fabric of his grand expedition. But the night of the 22nd brought a new tension. The English fleet, led by Nelson, loomed close, a ghostly shadow passing just 6 leagues from the French. Nelson, having learned of Malta's fall at Messina, set his course directly for Alexandria, the true heart of the French expedition. Swift and unburdened by convoy, he arrived there on the 28th of June, 3 days ahead of the French fleet, which, though it had sailed earlier, took a longer route via Candia, favoured by the steady Etesian winds that ruled the season. On board the great ship Orient, Bonaparte found moments of calm amid the restless sea. He engaged often with Monge and Berthollet, their conversations drifting through the realms of chemistry, mathematics, and the mysteries of religion. General Caffarelli, whose wit and lively mind sparked bright discourse, was a favoured companion. Though Bonaparte held a fondness for Berthollet, it was Monge's imaginative spirit that drew him more closely, their thoughts intertwining in a dance of ideas that balanced between faith and reason. Berthollet's cool, analytical mind often teased Monge's more poetic inclinations, and Bonaparte, ever restless, found himself at odds with materialism, yearning for deeper truths beyond the cold logic of science. His curiosity extended beyond philosophy to the practical matters of war. Conversations with Admiral Brueys were frequent and probing, the General-in-Chief's questions sharp and insightful, revealing a mind always hungry for knowledge. Once, when he inquired how hammocks were stowed before battle, he resolved that if called to action, every man should cast his baggage into the sea, a symbol of readiness and sacrifice. Yet despite his restless mind, Bonaparte often lay in his cabin, rocked gently by the ship's movements, seeking relief from the seasickness that plagued him on these turbulent waters. In the quiet of his cabin, I was often by his side, reading aloud from the works he chose for his camp library, while he spent long hours in conversation with the captains of the vessels we encountered. His questions were always the same, a steady rhythm. Whence did you come? Where do you sail? What ships have you met? Satisfied with their answers, he would bid them continue on, with strict orders to reveal nothing of our presence. The Orient was a bustling, floating city, home to 2,000 souls, many of them men of distinction. Bonaparte's table was a gathering place, where generals, colonels, and his household shared meals and conversation. When the sun smiled upon the deck, he would stroll the quarter-deck, a grand promenade that stretched beneath the vast sky. I remember well one such evening in Sicilian waters, when I fancied I saw the peaks of the Alps bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Bonaparte laughed at my enthusiasm, calling Admiral Brueys to confirm the view through his telescope. The sight stirred something deep within him. He stood silent for a long while, lost in thought, before breaking into a sudden exclamation. "No, I cannot behold the land of Italy without emotion. There is the East, and there I go. A perilous enterprise invites me. Those mountains command the plains where I so often had the good fortune to lead the French to victory. With them, we will conquer again." After dinner, one of Bonaparte's cherished pastimes was to set forth a proposition, inviting 3 or 4 men to argue its cause, while an equal number opposed it. These debates were more than mere entertainment. They were a means to study the minds of those around him, to discern the talents best suited for the tasks he envisioned. Curiously, he favored those who could defend the most absurd ideas with skill over those who argued reason with equal eloquence. The subjects were varied: religion, government, the art of war, sometimes pondering the habitation of planets, the age of the world, the possible destruction of Earth by fire or water, or the truth of dreams and presentiments. Each topic was a thread woven into Bonaparte's restless mind, ever seeking to understand and to command. Passing the island of Candia, his imagination soared with tales of ancient Crete and the colossal statues that once stood proud, now faded into legend. He spoke with fervor of the fall of the Eastern Empire, a realm drenched in blood and glory, and of the myths that clothed history with poetry and inspiration. The birthplace of Jupiter called to his thoughts on laws and governance, while the need for religion to bind mankind unfolded in his reflections. These animated conversations carried us until the north winds, driving clouds into the valley of the Nile, veiled Candia from our view. Music floated sometimes from the decks below, soft serenades that echoed between the timbers, though Bonaparte's taste for melody was yet unformed, growing only as his power grew. Hunting, too, was a pleasure he reserved for later days, as if to prove that within him stirred not only the genius of command, but also the instincts of kings. The sea voyage was not without its dangers. In a crowded ship like the Orient, accidents were inevitable. Men sometimes fell overboard, swallowed by the dark embrace of the waves. Yet in these moments, the general's humanity shone bright. Though he would soon command armies that spilled rivers of blood, here he was consumed by anxiety until the lost souls were rescued. On one occasion, a sailor, previously punished, leapt into the sea to save a comrade. Bonaparte not only pardoned his fault, but rewarded him with money, a gesture of gratitude and justice. Another night, a splash in the darkness stirred alarm. The ship was halted, and brave men plunged into the sea to recover what they feared was a man. Instead, they hauled aboard a quarter of a bullock, yet Bonaparte insisted the sailors be rewarded generously for their courage, saying, "It might have been a sailor, and these brave fellows have shown as much activity and courage as if it had." Even after 30 years, these memories remain vivid, as if the voyage were unfolding now, the sea and sky alive with the hopes and fears of those who sailed toward destiny. In this manner, Bonaparte filled his days aboard the Orient, shaping his mind and his plans as the shores of Egypt drew nearer. It was during this time that he dictated to me a proclamation, a stirring call to the soldiers under his command. "Soldiers, you are about to undertake a conquest, the effects of which on civilization and commerce are incalculable. The blow you are about to give to England will be the best aimed and the most sensibly felt she can receive until the time arrive when you can give her death blow. We must make some fatiguing marches. We must fight several battles. We shall succeed in all we undertake. The destinies are with us. The Mameluke beys who favor exclusively English commerce, whose extortions oppress our merchants, and who tyrannize over the unfortunate inhabitants of the Nile, a few days after our arrival, will no longer exist. The people amongst whom we are going to live are Mahometans. The first article of their faith is this: there is no God but God, and Mahomet is his prophet. Do not contradict them. Behave to them as you have behaved to the Jews, to the Italians. Pay respect to their muftis and their imams, as you did to the rabbis and the bishops. Extend to the ceremonies prescribed by the Quran, and to the mosques the same toleration which you And so, as night fell, the march continued. The merchants whose heavy hands weigh down our trade, and the cruel rulers who oppress the poor souls living along the Nile, they would vanish like shadows in the dawn, mere days after our arrival. The people among whom we were destined to dwell were followers of Mahomet, their faith wrapped in the solemn words, "There is no God but God, and Mahomet is his prophet." It was not for us to challenge these beliefs. We were to treat them with the same respect we had shown the Jews, the Italians, honoring their muftis, their imams, as we had honored rabbis and bishops. The mosques, the ceremonies of the Quran, were to be met with the same quiet tolerance we had displayed toward synagogues, toward the religions of Moses and Jesus Christ. The Roman legions had protected all faiths, and so must we. Customs would differ from Europe's, yes. The treatment of women, for example, was not as we knew it. Yet, in every land, the violator of peace and decency was a monster. Pillage, the spoils of war, enriched but a few. It brought dishonor, it destroyed our own strength, and turned those who might have been friends into bitter enemies. The first city on our path was Alexander's creation, a place where every stone whispered grand tales, where the echoes of Ptolemies and Caesars still lingered. At every step, these ancient memories stirred the blood and fired the hearts of Frenchmen. But as we sailed toward this storied land, the weight upon us was heavy, not just the grandeur of history, but the burdens of uncertainty and dread. Admiral Brueys, a man both brave and burdened, confided in me during the voyage, especially as we neared Alexandria. His voice carried the weight of unease. The fleet was ill-prepared, the ships laden with too much baggage, their crews weak and inexperienced. The great ship Orient was encumbered, the transports too many, the readiness too slight. Brueys spoke of courage, the kind needed to command such a fleet. He feared the consequences if we met the enemy at sea, how the confusion of so many souls aboard would spell disaster. Even against a smaller English force, he doubted their chances. Victory seemed a distant dream. Even if won, what good would it bring to our expedition? God grant, he sighed, that we might pass the English without meeting them. His words were a quiet prophecy of the trials to come, not upon the open waves, but in a place he thought more defensible. And then, on the morning of the first day of July, we glimpsed Africa's coast. The column of Septimus Severus stood tall, pointing like a silent sentinel to the city of Alexandria. Yet, our minds were too weighed with the present to dwell on the grandeur before us, the ancient city with its twin harbours, its lighthouse that once pierced the sky, its monuments of colossal memory. We did not yet dream of the history beneath our feet. Admiral Brueys sent ahead the frigate Juno to fetch the French consul, Monsieur Magalon, who arrived late in the afternoon, battling a rough sea. He brought news that stirred both relief and urgency. Nelson had been off Alexandria on the 28th, but upon not finding us, had sailed northeast, believing we aimed for Syria. A twist of fate had spared us, for had we arrived together, the English fleet might have descended upon us. Bonaparte, hearing this, resolved swiftly to disembark. Brueys cautioned him. The surge was fierce, the coast treacherous with reefs, night was approaching, and our knowledge of landing spots was nil. He urged patience, a delay of 12 hours, noting Nelson would not return for days. But Bonaparte, impatient and driven by a restless belief in fortune's favour, would not wait. "Fortune gives me but 3 days," he declared. "If I do not seize them, We are lost. The admiral, bound by Bonaparte's command over both sea and land, yielded. It was not, as some have claimed, the sighting of a distant sail that spurred Bonaparte's exclamation of desperation. No such moment passed in my presence. Instead, under the cloak of night, at 1 o'clock on the 2nd day of July, we set foot upon Egyptian soil at Marabou, a few leagues west of Alexandria. Lives were lost, but fewer than feared. By 3 in the morning, Bonaparte advanced toward Alexandria with divisions of Kleber, Bon, and Manu. The Bedouin Arabs, ever elusive, haunted our flanks and rear, snatching up stragglers as shadows in the dark. Approaching close to the city, the ramparts rose before us, formidable yet soon overcome by French valor. The first blood I saw in this war was that of General Kleber, struck in the head by a ball, not during the storming of the walls, but as he led the attack. He came to Pompey's Pillar, where many of us gathered, and where Bonaparte watched the struggle unfold. It was there I first spoke with Kleber, and from that moment a friendship blossomed, nurtured by the small aid I was able to provide amid scarcity. The capture of Alexandria was swift, its walls poorly fortified and soon scaled. Contrary to tales spun like silk, the city was not pillaged. Such ruinous beginnings would have been folly, alienating the very people whose friendship we needed. Bonaparte and a small group, including myself, entered the city through a narrow street, scarcely wide enough for two to walk side by side. We were halted by musket shots from a low window, a man and a woman firing again and again. The guides before us returned fire, and both assailants fell silent and dead. The city had surrendered. For 6 days, Bonaparte labored tirelessly to impose order on Alexandria and the surrounding province, demonstrating a vigor and genius I could never cease to marvel at. He directed the army's march across the province of Bohahire, sending Desai with infantry and cavalry toward Beda on the road to Damanhur. Desai was the first to taste the bitter cup of privation that would soon afflict all. His spirit, loyal and strong, wavered before the harsh realities. On the 15th of July, he wrote pleadingly from Bohahire, "Do not let us linger here. My men are discouraged and murmur. Move us forward or retreat without delay. These villages are mere huts, offering no resources." Across these vast plains, scorched by the sun's relentless gaze, water became a prize more precious than gold. Wells and springs, hidden like treasures, were often filled or fouled by those who wished us ill. The army crossed the desert with the speed of lightning, scarcely tasting a drop. The thirst was a torment, only briefly quenched by brackish, bitter water that stung the tongue and failed to soothe the soul. The soldiers' murmurs grew heavy with discouragement. On the first night, a grave error nearly cost us dearly. We rode through the darkness, barely awake, the escort thin and weary, when suddenly musket fire cracked through the night twice in quick succession. Alarmed, we gathered ourselves and discovered to our relief that the wound was slight, a mere flesh wound to one of our guides. The attackers were none other than Desai's own division, forming the army's vanguard, who had mistaken us for the enemy. It was soon clear that a call of challenge had not been heard between the two parties. When we reached Damanhur, our headquarters was set in the house of a sheik. From the outside, the home appeared freshly whitewashed and respectable, but inside lay a misery beyond imagining. The walls whispered of poverty, the rooms echoed with neglect. This was a land of contradictions, richness and ruin, splendor and squalor, hope and hardship intertwined beneath the same sun. And so, as the days folded into nights, the army pressed onward, driven by Bonaparte's restless will and the uncertain fortune that danced ever before us. The mirage shimmered on the horizon, an illusion of water where none awaited, a cruel promise in a land of dust and thirst. The Arabs watched and harried us. The desert stretched endlessly, and the march continued, relentless and unyielding. And so, as night fell, the march continued. The night air hung heavy with the faint scent of dust and smoke as our small party pressed forward, only to discover that the only harm suffered was a slight wound to one of our guides. The confusion had been caused by the division of General Desai, the advanced guard of our army, who, in the murky half-light, had mistaken us for the enemy and opened fire. The sharp crack of musketry had shattered the stillness, but soon it was understood that our own little vanguard had failed to hear the customary challenge, the qui-vive, from Desai's sentries. Thus, what might have been a deadly encounter was only a brief, uneasy alarm. When we arrived at Damanhur, our headquarters were set up in the residence of a local sheikh. From outside, the house appeared respectable, its walls freshly whitewashed, gleaming faintly under the sun, a modest beacon of stability in a land so often at war. Yet, stepping inside was to enter a realm of despair. The interior was a ruin of broken domestic wares, the floor strewn with shards and debris. The only seats were tattered mats, stained and threadbare, offering scant comfort. Bonaparte, ever perceptive, noted this contradiction, and having gained some measure of the sheikh's confidence, asked through the interpreter why a man of such means would live in such squalor. The sheikh's answer was a quiet lament. Years earlier, he had refurbished his home, but the news of his expenditure had reached Cairo, where envy and suspicion bred demands for money, tributes extorted under threat and force. When he refused, he suffered harsh treatment and was ultimately compelled to pay. Since then, he had chosen to live in poverty, to avoid the rapacity that accompanies any sign of wealth. His limp bore witness to the cruelty he had endured. In this land, to appear prosperous was to invite ruin. Poverty was the only shield against the ceaseless grasp of power and greed. As we lingered there, a small troop of Arabs on horseback suddenly charged toward our headquarters, their wild cries cutting through the stillness. Bonaparte, standing at the window of the sheikh's house, was stirred to anger by this brazen affront. He turned sharply to one of his aides-de-camp, Crozier, who was on duty nearby, and ordered, "Take a few guides and drive those fellows away." In moments, Crozier was galloping across the plain with 15 guides at his back. From the window, we watched the skirmish unfold, a hesitant, faltering clash. Croizier's men seemed reluctant, their charge half-hearted, as the Arabs pressed their attack again and again. "Forward, I say! Charge!" Bonaparte's voice rose in frustration, though it was swallowed by the distance and the chaos. Yet the horsemen faltered, and the Arabs, undeterred, withdrew unscathed, their retreat unmolested. Bonaparte's fury was unbound. When Crozier returned, he met a harsh rebuke that left the young officer crushed and humiliated. I was sent to offer words of comfort, but Croizier's spirit was broken. "I cannot survive this," he whispered bitterly. "I will sacrifice my life at the first chance. I will not live dishonored." The word coward had fallen from the general's lips, a wound deeper than any bullet. Croisier's story ended far from here, at Saint-Jean d'Acre, where his life was claimed by the relentless march of war. On the 10th of July, our headquarters moved once more, settling at Ramahania, where we remained through the 11th and 12th. Here began the ancient canal, cut by Alexander the Great to bring water to his shining city, a lifeline between Europe and the East. The calm river whispered of history as the flotilla, under the command of the brave chief of division Perret, arrived from Rosette aboard the Xebec Surf. Bonaparte trusted Perret deeply, recalling his command over naval forces in the Adriatic years before, a testament to his steadfastness amid the tides of war. The general placed on board the Surf and the other vessels those who were not soldiers, whose roles in battle were limited, and whose horses were spared to mount a few troops. The night of the 14th of July saw Bonaparte direct the army's march southward along the Nile's left bank, while the flotilla sailed parallel, a slender thread of ships gliding through the dark waters. But the wind, blowing steadily from the Mediterranean, pushed the flotilla far ahead of the army, breaking the careful plan that would have allowed them to protect and support one another. Alone and exposed, the flotilla soon encountered 7 Turkish gunboats sailing from Cairo, their guns trained and deadly. Alongside them, the Mamelukes, Fellahs, and Arabs lined the riverbanks, wielding small guns mounted on camels, a strange and fearsome sight. Perret ordered the Surf to anchor, and the battle began at 9 in the morning, the roar of cannon fire echoing across the river and valley. For hours, the fight raged, a desperate, uneven struggle, until 12:30. Meanwhile, Bonaparte himself engaged a force of some 4,000 Mamelukes, seeking to outflank them on the left of the village of Chebrace and drive them toward the Nile's edge. By mid-morning, Perret sent word that the Turks were inflicting more damage than we could return, that ammunition was running low, and the army was too far inland to come to their aid. Several vessels had already fallen to the Turks, who showed no mercy, massacring crews before our eyes and brandishing the severed heads of their victims with barbarous cruelty. Perret risked his life dispatching messengers to inform Bonaparte of the dire situation. The general heard the distant cannonade and the explosion of a Turkish gunboat blown apart by the Surf's artillery, and feared the worst. He ordered a movement to the left, toward the Nile and Chebrace, and his forces struck the Mamelukes hard, forcing them to retreat toward Cairo. At the sight of the French advance, the Turkish flotilla weighed anchor and sailed upriver, while the banks emptied of enemy forces. The flotilla escaped destruction, though not without suffering. 20 men killed, many wounded, and more than 1,500 cannon shots fired in the fierce struggle. General Berthier later recorded the names of those who, though not soldiers, stood by Perret in this perilous fight: Monge, Berthollet, Andreossi, the paymaster, Junot, and Bourrienne, who served as Bonaparte's secretary. Rumors of the Commissary General Soucy's severe wounding while defending a gunboat are unfounded, but the danger was real and ever present. For days, we had no contact with the main army. On the 22nd of July, the pyramids came into view, their timeless silhouettes etched against the sky. We learned we were but 10 leagues from Gizeh, the site of those ancient monuments. The distant cannonade grew louder as the north wind died away, a grim herald of battle. That day, the banks of the Nile were strewn with bodies, the river washing them slowly into the sea, a silent, terrible procession of death. The surrounding villages, once hostile and armed against us, were eerily quiet. The firing from the river banks ceased. It was clear a deadly battle had been fought, and the Mamelukes had suffered a grievous defeat. Our passage from Ramahanya to Gizeh was marked by misery beyond words. 11 days we lived on little more than melons and water, exposed at every moment to the skirmishing fire of Arabs and fellahs. Death and injury shadowed us, yet we escaped with only a few casualties. The Nile was beginning to rise, and near Cairo, its shallows forced us to abandon the Zebek for a smaller vessel, a germ. We reached Gizeh by 3 in the afternoon on the 23rd of July. When I finally greeted the general after 12 long days, he looked at me with a mixture of relief and reproach. "So you are here, are you? You know you have caused me to delay pursuing the battle of Chebris. It was only to save you, Monge, Berthollet, and the others aboard the flotilla that I hurried my left wing toward the Nile before my right had fully turned Chebris. Had it not been for you, not a single Mameluke would have escaped." I replied with a faint smile, "I thank you for your concern, but could you, in all conscience, have abandoned us after taking our horses and forcing us onto the Zebek, whether we wished it or not?" He laughed, the tension easing from his face, and then spoke of his regret over Susi's wound and the loss of many valuable men whose places could not easily be filled. Bonaparte tasked me with writing a letter to his brother Louis, informing him of our complete victory over the Mamelukes at Mbabe, opposite Boulac. 2,000 enemy dead and wounded, 40 captured guns, and countless horses taken. The triumph at Mbabe led swiftly to the occupation of Cairo. Bonaparte established his headquarters in the home of Elfi Bey, in the great square of Esbekieh, the heart of the city. The march of the French army to Cairo had been relentless, a ceaseless succession of battles and victories, at Ramahanya, Chebris, and the pyramids. The Mamelukes were broken, their leader Murad Bey forced to flee into Upper Egypt. After only 20 days of campaigning, Bonaparte found no obstacle to bar his entrance into the capital of Egypt. No conqueror, perhaps, ever enjoyed And so, as night fell, the march continued.